Food Manager Christianity's Position. Scientific tests date the shroud to the 1st century. Part 1. Before we look at possible shroud references in the New Testament, we consider scientific inquiries into its age. Real Seeker Ministries links to most of the cited sources. Any reliable textile dating method must satisfy 4 steps. Experimentally define and measure a trait that varies with time. Test samples of known historical age, and calibrate mathematical formulas for the trait-time relationship. Calculate margins of error due to environmental factors, such as the 1532 fire that damaged the shroud. Proper sample selection reduces the environmental effects. Apply the formulas and margins of error to estimate the age of the shroud. The shroud's linen is made from flax plants. Studies by Italian scientist Dr. Giulio Fanti and his team show 2 strong correlations between the age of flax fibers and their cellulose chains. Over time, the chains become more disordered, and their length decreases. Fanti's team measured these correlations with 2 tests, comparing wavelengths of the shroud fibers to flax samples of known age. The first, Raman spectroscopy, vibrates the flax sample's chemical bonds with laser beams. When the bonds return to their normal energy state, they produce peaks in the Raman spectrum. Fanti's second dating method uses Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, or FTIR. 3 samples were used to test the fire effects, and 8 to calibrate formulas. The Raman and FTIR tests date the shroud to 59 AD and 250 BC respectively, plus or minus 400 years at 95% confidence. So 2 different test results overlap with Jesus' time. Neither support a medieval date. Of course, not everyone agrees. These sources offer 4 credible challenges. First, did Fanti test actual shroud fibers? There's definitely a chain of custody issue. The shroud's custodian, Cardinal Nosiglia, writes that we can't be sure the tested fibers are authentic, so the owners cannot recognize any serious value to the results of these alleged experiments. Second, many samples were collected, but few were used. Did Fanti simply reject samples that undermine his case? One skeptic notes that codes C, G, I, and J are missing from this chart, and only 42% of the remaining samples were actually tested, all from arid desert climates. It sure looks like selection bias and poor controls. Third, the 1532 fire was hot enough to melt silver. Shouldn't this affect the cloth's chemistry and test results? Fourth, why haven't other scientists used Fanti's process? Wouldn't museums and art galleries rush to date their textiles with these non-destructive tests? We'll respond in order. First, Fanti says he tested tiny fibers extracted from the shroud by microanalyst Giovanni Righi. Here are reasons to believe him. Fanti's microscope photos show the samples have the same rare features as the shroud, including Z-twist threads, specific defects, and that the fiber changes to a coral color if the polarization angle is rotated. Documents in Fanti's book trace his tested samples to Righi. Witnesses in 1988 remarked on the open, official manner in which Righi took and documented the samples. This suggests the Cardinal's predecessor approved it, despite the Church's official position now. If not from the shroud, where did Fanti get fibers that so closely match its microscopic traits? Second, was selection bias at play? Not likely. Fanti reduced the sample population through several phases of tests. From the entire population, he needed ancient linen of discernible age, of sufficient size and sturdiness, with few environmental effects. For example, the samples from wetter climates were too deteriorated to use. If the only samples as sturdy as the shroud come from arid climates, this is not selection bias, but additional evidence the shroud comes from an arid climate. Further, Fanti wants more samples, calling his work only indicative of a trend that must be confirmed with future analyses. Therefore, he computed large margins of error. Last, if skeptics suggest Fanti's team lacks transparency, we disagree. If I'm hiding sample C, for instance, I wouldn't name the other samples A, B, and D, making it obvious C is missing. And to hide my rejection of 58% of collected samples, I'd simply list the 42% I tested. Dishonest people tend to hide their dishonesty, not advertise it. Third, shouldn't the 1532 fire greatly affect the results? No. Fonte's team tested for the answer, using several of the chart's alleged missing samples to quantify the fire's effects. Further, researcher Dr. Stefano Dell'Acqua simulated the shroud's age by heating linen to match the shade of the shroud. Tests of his fabric showed that heat didn't affect the intensity of the Raman peaks, but did affect the FTIR evaluation. Fonte's team incorporated these findings into their age model, concluding the fire effects are well below the margin of error. The scientific explanation is easily illustrated. The shroud's black scorch marks end abruptly. Linen doesn't conduct heat well, so the scorches don't extend far from the burn. Even intense heat hardly impacts the cloth an inch away. Fourth, how valid can Fonte's tests be if no one else uses them? This is not the major hurdle it appears. That no one chooses to use a tool doesn't mean the tool doesn't work. Fonte's process was peer-reviewed in this paper, adding confidence the tools do work. Besides, for practical reasons, others may be slow to adopt them. Finding and recovering suitable ancient fibers is hard and expensive, making it less likely others will use them. Fonte's team had little choice but to develop these tools, since the Church is not providing new samples. Other scientists, however, might not be so constrained and choose to stick with proven methods. Finally, since Fonte's spectroscopic tests are non-destructive, others could run the same tests on the exact same samples. So while it's true no one's used his techniques yet, it's also true no one has disproven them. In sum, our position is that Fonte tested actual shroud fibers. His large margin of error sufficiently accounts for the small sample size and the effects of the 1532 fire, and he validly dates the shroud to Jesus' time and climate. Next, additional repeatable tests also fit the first century dating.